So I just had to sign a talent declaration, so you can decide afterwards whether I should have put no talent on it, or talent, I mean so. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Pan-Canadian Framework. Very early days on the Pan-Canadian Framework, but we have a long history of disunity within the Federation, the Canadian Federation, disunity on all kinds of files, but on the climate file in particular. And so I'm going to sort of focus on sort of where we are and how we got here. I'm going to do a sort of a David Letterman's top 5 list to keep us engaged after lunch so we don't fall asleep. And I'm going to start with a little diagnostic about, well, where are we on the emissions, and just sort of picking up on some of the earlier conversations about sort of the modeling and analysis on target attainment. And yeah, so we'll go from there. This is work I've been doing with Chris Bataille out of FSU, IDRI, and he's just been appointed an IPCC Working Group 3 lead author. And Katie Sullivan, the top 5 list from the International Emissions Trading Association. 2 people are really plugged into deep decarbonization and the state of play with carbon policy, both within Canada and globally. And again, they have more talent than I do. So I do economic modeling and economy-wide modeling. And I like to caveat the work, so warning, and this is a deep decarbonization work where we're forecasting to 2050. We don't know GDP next quarter. We don't know what we're going to have for dinner, perhaps. And so I'm talking about 2050 and 2030. So yeah, warning, Harry Potter scenarios at work. Wave your magic wand and chant expecto decarbonis, expecto depoliticus, and often with deep decarbonization work, expecto de-economists. We suspend sort of cost effectiveness. We really don't care what it costs to hit the targets because the numbers go through the roof. So that's a caveat, right? What did you learn from modeling, not what are the numbers? Okay, so here's some emission runs we did looking at a long-term transition for Canada, part of the Deep Decarbonization Project. The little red dot is our nationally determined contribution. The lines going down are sort of squeezing the models to try and hit some pretty deep trajectories, taking our current emission profile from about 20 tons per capita, as mentioned this morning, 70 to 80 tons per capita in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and grinding it down to 1.7 tons per capita, or even less under a 1.5 degrees C world. So you can see the pathways. The top line is a 2 degrees C pathway. The bottom line is a slower or a faster transition to a 1.5, and you can sort of see the sort of scale of the change from current trajectory, which is basically flatlining on emissions. So then we say, okay, we start layering in some of the current policies that we see, the Pan-Canadian Framework and other provincial policies that have been in existence for quite a long time. And if you look back to 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, when the Harper government was in power before the Trudeau government and the Pan-Canadian, the gap looked insurmountable. It looked absolutely crazy. We thought we didn't have the scalable policy architecture to really hit the targets that the government had talked about. You move on a year later. This is sort of the response of the Pan-Canadian Framework of the federal carbon price, basically filling policy holes in Alberta, or excuse me, in Saskatchewan, in Manitoba, Atlantic region, raising ambition a little bit in some provinces. With an increased carbon price, so you get about 18 to 20 megatons of incremental emission reductions out of the carbon price floor. It gets a lot of attention. It's important. I'll talk a bit about it in a second. It's important, but it wasn't. It's not that big a deal. When you add in Ontario and Quebec's policies that have really deep targets and aligned programs, not just their carbon trading programs, but also their revenue and proceeds spending and their offsets programs, and then their complementary regulations. So this isn't just the WCI backstop importing emission reductions when there's a gap between the carbon price and their targets. It's actually the whole series of complementary policies that we just don't understand yet, but they're being rolled out. And that's why Environment Canada basically says, well, we're going to use the WCI as a backstop, and that's why you see 55 megatons of emission reductions. But all that to say, Quebec and Ontario are doing some very heavy lifting for the rest of the country with their programs, and we're seeing policy aligned to those targets. And then you add in some additional Pan-Canadian framework policies, notably the Clean Fuel Standard, which is about 40 megatons of emission reductions. They're talking about 30 to 40 megatons. big numbers. I'll talk a bit about that in a second. And you sort of see a gap, sort of a year and a half later, a year after the government's been in. If you believe the policies, and we have in the governments, and we have a history in Canada of governments not delivering on their emission reduction pledges. But we're seeing actually the policy architecture in place, which is different than in the past, which can be tuned to deeper decarbonization. So that's sort of the state of play. So if you believe the governments, and if you think the policies are durable, you can probably scale them to sort of a deeper decarbonization level. So that's a quick sort of state of play of where we are. And I'm going to jump now into sort of the top 5 list, as it were, about where we are and what the Pan-Canadian framework has possibly done in cooperation with the existing policies. So number 5, fragmentation, nation gets aligned. So the federal inaction on climate policy over successive governments, I think there's 10 or 12 plans, I forget the number, since 1999, green plans, etc. along the way. I think it's 9 actually. Federal government plans, backslides. Provinces sort of unevenly have stepped in to implement architecture, policy architecture. That policy architecture has now been cemented with the Pan-Canadian framework because, of course, the Pan-Canadian framework defers to the provincial policies. There's no preemption, no federal preemption, basically saying, hey, we're going to overlay on top of you folks. Politically too costly. Liberal government chose not to go that way, so we now have this fragmentation nation that exists, and then the question is, well, what does it mean and what's going to happen? Well, clearly we're going to have some very uneven policy coverage and stringency. You may have 2 cap-and-trade programs coexisting in Ontario and Quebec with very different design choices. They look the same superficially, but if you dig deep and scratch a little deeper, they may be significantly different in some areas. So we're going to have that we're going to have to live with. I think it's okay for ambition now, but if you want to go to deep decarbonization, we run into some serious problems around higher costs as you ratchet down the policy ambition and costs start to rise, and regulatory burdens, cost alignment get worse, with higher ambition. I'm just going to breathe for a second. And so when we do integrated modeling of this stuff, we see significantly higher prices associated with these fragmented islands, these mitigation islands. So you're talking 25, in some cases 50% higher costs associated with this fragmentation, especially when you get into deeper ambition. So it's okay now, but if you want to go deeper and be politically durable by keeping costs down, you have to do something about it. So this is what the Pan-Canadian framework has done. So governance matters, big focus in the Pan-Canadian framework on governance. And it is focusing on Pan-Canadian alignment on regulatory burdens, costs, and equivalent policy outcomes, which is a slippery slope. I won't go into too much detail there. But importantly, the Federation is talking and putting in these governance structures, or at least thinking about governance structures that might likely make success more durable, including something like Linda Duncan had mentioned this morning, something like the UK Climate Committee. We see stuff yesterday about the National Energy Board as well. So we're seeing a movement towards better governance structures, and we'll see how that plays out. But anyway, number 5, fragmentation nation. Building carbon bridges. So this is emissions trading within the Federation. If you're not going to have a unified carbon tax on top of everything, and you have these other sort of systems, can you then sort of linking by degrees, a good RFF term, research for the futures term, some paper and some work done on that, basically saying, well, let's sort of figure out how we can align. Let's sort of play at the edges and work towards a unified goal around alignment and then unification. So this is important because we see high abatement costs in Canada, high abatement costs between provinces, and certainly between Canada and its trading partners. And we see with sort of Canada championing Article 6 under the Paris Agreement, this focus on internationally traded units is probably a good thing, and certainly the Pan-Canadian framework recognizing the WCI permit imports out of California into true-up Ontario and Quebec, whatever level they may be at, as a big step, because it sort of recognizes, okay, we can do some trading with outside our borders, and it's a nice cost containment mechanism if we want to go deeper in ambition or we want to achieve our targets if we fall short. The federal carbon pricing floor is filling policy holes. I mean, I work in the provinces quite a bit, and we see policy development underway in all jurisdictions with some level of emission trading, typically for the large final emitters, but we see all kinds of flexible compliance mechanisms being developed that are associated with emissions trading, so that the Pan-Canadian framework has catalyzed that a little bit. And then we see really sort of this reducing cost with linked trade. When we put this stuff into the integrated models, we see, sort of costs, the marginal cost to hit your target, even with really aggressive complementary regulations like building codes and vehicle standards, that we have. You see prices go from about $220 down to about $100 a ton to close the gap to that WCI. So whether or not these prices are real, I don't know. It's way out of the future, but significant efficiency savings associated with compliance flexibility around trading, and we seem to be building the compliance architecture there. Looking forward, we see this clean fuel standard coming forward, which is basically putting it's like an ethanol mandate, but a national ethanol mandate for industry and for liquid fuels, like ethanol and biodiesel, but also renewable natural gas, which is sort of methane out of farms and maybe syngas out of industry. National trading associated with these, so this is something to look forward to, not forward, maybe you're not, depending on your view on it, but this is sort of moving forward. So the PCF has catalyzed these carbon bridges, as it were, both now and looking into the future. Okay, number 3, so boring as heck. Take me to your stock taking. Well, what does that mean? Well, really assessing and reporting on policy performance and competitiveness outcomes. So the PCF is really pushing the provinces to come forward with some sort of evidence that they're achieving their targets, or maybe they're providing equivalent outcomes, a messy, slippery slope, but equivalent policy outcomes. So there's a whole push towards that. And then at the same time, the federal government is being pushed internationally by the UNFCCC to report on performance. So we see a whole series of stock-taking milestones rolling forward between now and 2022 that basically set or look at ambition within Canada and then performance outside of Canada. At the same time, you've got third-party auditors and evaluators coming in and live auditing policy development. So I was involved in the Ontario Cap and Trade Design System. We had 3 separate sets of auditors in the room all the time, even before the draft regulation was produced and published. And that's a big deal. So governments are being held increasingly to account and to be more transparent around their outcomes. And then finally, this is less relevant perhaps here, but really get your pen out because governments want your data. So there's a movement for not just GHG data, but production data and all kinds of other information and indicators. There's a whole development that's going to happen, process development around indicators and performance reporting. And I think that will increase transparency ultimately. 2 more slides. Okay. Policy packages and packing on policies. Big debate, James mentioned it this morning in Canada about, I like taxes, I like trading, I like regulations, I like nothing. Well, the reality is, these instrument choice junkies who have our preferences, you've lost. Because we have this mix of instruments forevermore. They're jumbled together. The emissions trading looks like a tax. Tax may have some compliance flexibility that has some trading in it. Regulations are designed to look like emissions trading, a la the vehicle efficiency standards. So really, we've got this sort of hybrid economy approach emerging, which basically has carbon pricing, sort of tax or levy on liquid fuels, and then some sort of emissions trading for the large final emitters. But that may, there's all kinds of combinations on top of that, and then complementary regulations and a whole bunch of stuff. There are some gaps: subsidy reform, oil subsidy reform, for example. There's regulatory barriers we need to look at. You can't burn tires in Ontario, but you can certainly ship them to Michigan in the same airshed, and those tires can be burnt there in a cement kiln. So there's stuff like this that's, there's a lot of weirdness. And then information programs, someone mentioned this morning, information's always a compliment. We need to get folks on side. Okay, but in Fragmentation Nation, cohesion, efficiency, and effectiveness are a real concern. So the problem with this mix of instruments is this notion of equimarginal, which basically just says misaligned carbon costs. So one policy has a really high cost, one policy has a really low cost. So think British Columbia. So the tradable units for the British Columbia low carbon fuel standard were trading at $170 per ton when the carbon tax was $30. So this is sort of, in California, $90 versus $20. So you have one policy squeezing carbon in liquid fuels at $180, $170, and then at the same time coexisting, you've got another policy at $20. And so you get some really weird outcomes. And there, and which policy dominates? Is one effective? Is it cost effective? And there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to be considered there. When we throw this into the models, we see sort of a 30% cost effectiveness loss when you do measure by measure versus integrated run. which says, yeah, there's some, when we're packing on policies, we have to be careful. And we have to be a little smart about doing our stock take around what's working, what's not working, how are we filling gaps. And in the fragmentation nation, it gets even worse with provincial and federal. Andrew can talk a bit about electricity, I think, in Alberta, which is the best example I can think of. Okay, number one, so competitiveness neurosis in the time of Trump. So, this is governments, ministers get their doors kicked in on a daily basis from industry. They're very good at it. And really, governments have become quite comfortable with pricing carbon and applying regulations and dealing with the issue because they've sort of got their head around it. And they've also got some strategies and tools to deal with it. So again, Andrew can talk about targets in Alberta, prices versus quantity targets, and what the climate leadership plan said. But basically, governments are sort of working around, well, if I set a price, I'm worried about my costs, or I set a quantity target, so I'm going to hit this target, my costs go up. Oh, well, then I better put something in to make sure my costs don't go up too high. So these are like output-based allocations. We can reduce the impact on industry by not pricing all emissions. We can provide compliance flexibility. No, you can go get offsets over there. You can pay into a fund. We can use proceeds recycling. We can give you some money back. Here, reduce your emissions. Give us some cash. Oh, we'll funnel it back on income, but we'll maintain the hit on your emissions. So we were squeezing, emissions down, but we're reducing sort of the competitiveness, trade, potential risk by giving you some of the proceeds back, and of course, border carbon adjustments. I won't go too much into output-based pricing, although it's now ensconced in the Pan-Canadian framework, and it basically just says, look, we're not going to price all your emissions, but as I said, we're going to try and maintain this marginal incentive to abate. How are we doing on time? 1 minute, I'm almost there. Stroke of pen risk, Ontario. So this is right now, for those of you not familiar, carbon pricing is a political wedge that is being used on a daily basis. And once you have a policy in place, it may not be durable because the next party says, oh, we don't like that policy, our base doesn't like that policy, we're going to do something else, or we're going to do nothing. So there's this endless sort of competition about what to do, and it causes investment risk, and it's a fundamental problem. I won't talk about solutions-oriented. And then the last slide. Okay, so where are we? So I think Canada has a scalable policy foundation for increased ambition. We have efficient policy, so broad-based carbon pricing's now the national baseline. And we have established policies, so we have all kinds of existing performance-based regulations that are not too costly because they have this compliance flexibility, keep costs down. And then they're politically durable, right? So your policies to maintain competitiveness and ensure fairness, cutting checks to households. Andrew may talk about that in Alberta, but most governments now will cut checks when they roll out a new economy-wide carbon policy to bribe the households, basically. But as I said, the scale of decarbonization is significant. Costs rise even with efficient policy. So we really, as a federation, have to sort of look inside and think about the risks and how to basically, better align costs and not get too offside between emissions and regions with costs. And cohesive climate governance. I think that's the big PCF win, to be honest. Within the federation, we need more dialogue. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you.